Joining us from Houston, Texas, from the campus of Rice University is Peter Djerejian, who is a former U.S. ambassador to Syria, as we focus on the latest reports coming from that country, including the alleged use of chemical weapons. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us.
Good to be with you this morning, Steve.
One of the big questions, as we hear from Secretary of State Kerry, a new U.S. response to these allegations. First of all, what do you know?
Well, I'm not privy to the intelligence, but obviously both the American Secretary of State and now the French Foreign Minister have publicly stated that there is evidence that the regime of Bashar al-Assad did use chlorine gas in several attacks in recent weeks. So that is, obviously it's a chemical agent. It's not one of the chemical agents that are listed in the I believe that are listed in the chemical arsenal of the Syrian military that the agreement was reached to dismantle and destroy. But still, it is use of a chemical agent.
In fact, 14 different chemical weapons, according to U.S. intelligence. And here is what Secretary of State Kerry said just last week in Paris.
With respect to the CW and what the consequences are, it has been made clear by President Obama and others that use would result in consequences. We're not going to pin ourselves down to a precise time, date, manner of action, but there will be consequences if it were to be proven, including I might say things that are way beyond our control, have nothing to do with us, but the International Criminal Court and others are free to hold him accountable. And as you know, we have a resolution that will be in front of the United Nations with respect to culpability for crimes against humanity, atrocities in the course of this conflict. So one way or the other, there will be accountability.
Ambassador Djerejian, as you hear that comment, it's almost reminiscent of the so-called red line that we heard from the president. Will there be consequences, and if so, what are they?
Well, that's a very good question, Steve, because when the most extensive use of chemical weapons was deployed by the Bashar al-Assad regime, and over 1,000, I believe 400 people were killed, the red line was not activated. And then, you know, we went through that very complex scenario whereby, with Russian intervention, an agreement was made with Bashar al-Assad's regime to dismantle his chemical arsenal. Now, what the good news in all of this is that reportedly over 93% of his chemical weapons arsenal has been identified and taken out of the country. There's still work, obviously, to be done. But when I hear these words again, one has to be very precise. Is the use of these reportedly chlorine gas weapons a causus for action to be taken or not? That's not very clear in the statements I've heard.
Our guest served as the U.S. ambassador to Syria from 1988 to 1991. He is currently the public policy director at the Baker Institute on the campus of Rice University. And some news this morning from the Irish Times, and I just want to read to you what it's writing today, that from his base in Damascus, President Assad can contemplate a broad sweep of Syria, clawing back from the rebels who once threatened to drive him out. The capital, which they targeted, is now plastered with posters inviting Syrians to re-elect him as president. Powerful foreign allies have helped President Assad hold or retake a chain of cities which form the north-south backbone of the country, and the culmination will lead to the election on June 3rd that many dismiss as a farce, saying that, yes, he will be re-elected as president, but this is no campaign.
Well, the sheer decision that he's made to have elections, to rerun for the presidency for another 7-year term, this has been his goal from the very beginning. You go back 3 years. He has always focused on presidential elections where he would be reelected and extend his regime. The fact that these elections are being held in a country that is devastated by civil and sectarian warfare, where the government itself does not control all of its sovereign territory, belies the whole credibility of these elections. So he's making a political point that he's here, he's to be dealt with, that he has no intention of leaving power, and he will do everything to destabilize the opposition groups.
Did we do enough to try to help those trying to topple President Assad?
Well, here at the Baker Institute, approximately a year and a half, 2 years ago, we did a report on what the U.S. administration should contemplate doing in order to support the opposition and to pave the way for political transitional talks between the opposition and the regime of Bashar al-Assad to lead to constitutional reforms, parliamentary elections, and eventually a post-Assad era. We argued then, and again, this is a year and a half, 2 years ago, that the United States should be more muscular in supporting the Syrian opposition, identifying those elements, individuals, and groups in the opposition that were basically secular, moderate, and obviously not the Islamic radicals. We felt that this was a very realistic objective. It could be done. Those people existed then, exist today, and that the United States assistance should be not only humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, but limited military assistance. In other words, providing weapons to the Syrian opposition. We never advocated going far toward any scenario which would mean American boots on the ground. That is not a realistic objective for all the reasons we know after Iraq and Afghanistan. But we thought then that in order for the so-called Geneva process, Geneva I under Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN, and then Geneva II under Lakhdar Brahimi, the mediator who just stepped down, that the whole policy that was supported by the United States, the Europeans, and the international community was to obtain a ceasefire on the ground between the opposition groups and the regime, to start negotiations on a political transition between the regime and the opposition groups, leading to a scenario whereby there could be elections in the country that would be relatively free and fair, and entering into a post-Assad era. The problem with, I believe, our policy was that in order to give those Geneva initiatives any chance of success, the playing field between the opposition groups and the regime had to be leveled. The Syrian regime enjoys significant support from Russia, from Iran, and from Hezbollah. And this is material support, intelligence support, troops on the ground, especially in terms of Hezbollah. And the Syrian opposition receives mostly rhetorical support, humanitarian assistance, which is very important, but does not enjoy the same type of support whereby it could help level the playing field, especially the military playing field. The Syrian regime enjoys a monopoly of air power, as we've seen. It controls the skies. It has used these barrel bombs to destroy rebel and civilian areas with devastating impact. If you look at the city of Homs, which was a bastion of the rebellion, it looks akin to what Dresden looked like after World War II bombing. So I feel that we, the United States, should have been more robust 2 years ago. I cannot sit here and claim that we would be in a significantly better place, but we certainly would not be in a place where the president of Syria now, with impunity, is proceeding with presidential elections.
And there's a related story on this Sunday morning from inside the New York Times. Here is the headline: is the UN seeking more ways to distribute aid throughout Syria in light of what you were talking about, Ambassador Djerejian, the situation throughout the country. Our guest is with the Baker Institute at Rice University. He is a veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service, serving dating back to the Kennedy administration through the Clinton administration in a number of positions around the world. He's also a former Army lieutenant, a graduate of Georgetown University. Peter is joining us from Rockford, Illinois. Democrats Line, good morning.
Hello?
Go ahead, Peter, you're on the air.
Hey, how you doing? I was just trying to find out if white phosphorus was a chemical agent, and if I'm not mistaken, Israel used it on in Gaza.
I don't know if white phosphorus is part of the CW agreement that the U.S. and Russia brokered with the Syrian regime. I think the key objectives of that chemical warfare and bacteriological warfare agreement was more nerve gas and bacteriological and radiological weapons, especially racin and chemical agents like that, which are in the Syrian inventory. You see, the father of the current president, Hafez al-Assad, he was the man I dealt with when I was American ambassador in Syria from 1988 to 1991. He built up this chemical weapons arsenal as, if you will, a poor man's deterrent to possible conflict with Israel, under the assumption that Israel had a very powerful military capability, including nuclear weapons. So that is the arsenal that his son Bashar inherited, and unfortunately it's the part of that arsenal that he used against rebel and civilian forces, which caused those 1,400 odd deaths that caused a crisis on chemical weapons in Syria.
There's a follow-up to that from one of our viewers. How much interference is coming from the border with Iraq? Do you know?
A great deal, because one of the destabilizing factors, first of all, I mean, to put this into perspective, Steve, Syria has a population of approximately 22.5 million people. Because of this civil and sectarian war that's into its third year now, 9 million Syrians have been displaced in one way or another, internally, externally. The latest UN High Commission for Refugee figures put the Syrians in external refugee status at something like 2.7 million people. They are largely in Lebanon, where there are 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. That constitutes 1/4, 25% of the population of Lebanon. In Jordan, in Turkey, and in surrounding countries, and some that have been able to get to Europe and elsewhere. So if you look at the magnitude of the problem, you have 9 million people displaced, 2.7 refugees, 6.5 million are estimated to be displaced internally. So it's a huge humanitarian crisis, and getting aid to these people through UN agencies and NGOs is a massive problem. And the New York Times article that you mentioned indicates that something like 85% of the food assistance goes to areas that are controlled by the Syrian government, and 70-odd% of the medicine and pharmaceuticals go to areas controlled by the government. So the UN aid agencies are really challenged on how do you get this aid effectively to the people who need it, and how is it not filtered only through government-controlled areas where the government can take credit for providing assistance.
But as we look at these pictures, and this is one from today's New York Times, and you mentioned really the utter devastation throughout much of Syria, reminiscent of what we saw after World War II in Berlin, Germany. How is the country able to survive economically?
Well, it's a good question. You have to ask yourself the question, how has it not imploded completely? But there, Syria, before this chaotic situation occurred in starting in 2011, had various economic assets. It had an agricultural sector, an important one. It had oil and gas reserves. It had a very traditional, ancient business entrepreneurial class, a very vibrant merchant economy, and a very educated and industrious people. So all of that has not been broken over the last 3 years. There are remnants of it that remain, but it's a losing battle. As each year goes by and the civil war continues, the economic, social circumstances are going to deteriorate to a point whereby it's going to become a massive humanitarian crisis.
John is next, joining us from Union City, California. Good morning. Welcome to the Washington Journal.
Thanks. My question is, why should anyone seriously believe anything our government says about the countries it's itching to attack when it still hasn't come clean to the public about what really brought down Building 7 on 9/11?
Let me move on. We've addressed that issue, and we're talking about a different topic on this Sunday morning, but we did get a tweet from one of our viewers. Mr. Ambassador, why haven't the Syrian natives themselves risen up and eliminated Assad?
Well, the Syrian natives have risen up. A good proportion of Syria's population has risen up against Bashar al-Assad's regime. But the problem with the opposition is what I mentioned before. The regime enjoys a very significant monopoly of military, police, and intelligence power. It also enjoys the support of certain of the minorities, certain elements in the Christian community and other minority groups in Syria, because these groups fear the rise of Islamic radical groups amongst the opposition, especially the Christians. So the regime has these things go in its favor. The opposition, unfortunately, despite making valiant efforts, has been very disorganized. Lack of coordination amongst various groups, and lack of effective external support, as I mentioned before. But what has happened is a self-fulfilling prophecy that Bashar al-Assad, the president, stated early on, and that is that terrorist groups, Islamic radical terrorist groups, have infiltrated the chaotic situation in Syria. These Islamic radical groups thrive on instability and chaos, and that's where they infiltrate and they build their bases. That is what's happening now in Syria. So the opposition is fighting not only the regime, but is also fighting these Islamic radical groups. So the people, a good portion of the Syrian people have risen against Bashar al-Assad's regime, but their situation is conflicted. Steve, can I go back and give a little historical context, which I think will be very important for
Absolutely,
your listeners?
yes.
Yeah. If you go back to the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia, spread to Egypt, Yemen, and the rest of the Arab world, Libya, etc. When it came to Syria, it started in the southern town of Daraa, and students peacefully began to protest, and they were largely high school students, and they targeted 2 buildings to put graffiti on, to paint graffiti on with various anti-regime slogans. One was the Minister of Interior police station, which is obvious, political repression, the lack of political participation, the lack of free elections, anti-regime. But the other building they went to spread graffiti was Syriatel, which was the cell phone company of Syria. Now, this is very interesting. Why did these kids, these young kids, target that building? Well, Syriatel is the cell phone monopoly in Syria. It is owned by the Makhlouf family, who are the in-laws of Bashar al-Assad's family, And these kids knew, by this gesture of targeting this building, that one of the great challenges they faced in Syrian society was not only political repression, but economic corruption, kleptocracy, and a ruling family and its in-laws and its faithful were controlling the economy and stifling the growth of the Syrian economy to produce jobs and opportunities for the general population. This is very significant, and it started from the bottom up. There was no political leadership, no single leader, no single groups. And these demonstrations took on a life of their own, and it got to the point where Bashar al-Assad decided, his regime decided, that they would fire on these protests. And that's when the bloody confrontation began, and the downward spiral began, where it's become so bad now that 160,000 Syrians have lost their lives. I mentioned how many have been displaced internally and externally. And I've also described how Islamic radical groups have come into the country from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from other parts of the Arab world, and even Islamic radicals from Europe have come to join the fray, and their goal is to establish an Islamic state in Syria. And they even control, this group ISIS controls a chunk of territory in northern Syria where some of the oil fields are. And there even have been allegations that this ISIS group and the regime are in cahoots, and that they've been selling oil to the regime.
And just close the loop on that, because as we said earlier, the Irish Times is reporting this morning that President Assad has reaffirmed his control throughout much of the country, including in the capital city of Damascus. And ABC News is reporting this morning that Syrian rebels have captured one small village in northwestern Syria after killing some of Assad's supporters, but no indication on what the death toll is in that attack. And of course, as France and the U.S. confirming that Syria may have used chlorine and other chemical weapons in 14 recent attacks. Our guest is Peter Djerejian, who is the former U.S. ambassador to Syria, and now with Rice University, and he is the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Ron is joining us from Bayside, New York. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Ambassador. Thank you for your past service. Yeah, this is an incredibly difficult situation. I really don't know what the West or vis-a-vis the United States can do. Both sides are absolutely horrible. The regime, the Assad regime, is a terrible, brutal regime backed by our enemy, Iran. And the other side are a bunch of Islamist mixed groups fighting amongst themselves. And if we give them weapons such as anti-aircraft weapons, we don't know where that's going to end up, maybe shooting down an American or El Al plane. So I really don't see what we can do. I think we dropped the ball. Obama dropped the ball when this started. We could have helped the opposition, which was a little more clear on who we were dealing with, and now it's too late. And when we had the opportunity to go in and attack, which I really wasn't for, but when we say we're going to do it, we should do it, because that's the only thing they respect in that part of the world is power and force. So my question is, though, aren't we better off, as bad as Assad is, to have him stay in power, because we know what we have there, and he does stick to agreements vis-a-vis the Golan Heights? What's your response?
Thanks for the call, Ron. And just to follow up from Randy on that same note, saying, is the guest suggesting that the U.S. intervene in Syria no matter the economic cost to this country? So to both of these points, your response.
Well, I think the general parameters of, by the way, I'm glad to get a call from Bayside, because I come from Queens, and it's always good to get a call from someone from Queens. It's a very good question. I agree with your general comments. Again, I think that we had a better opportunity approximately 2 years ago to make an important difference in the situation on the ground in Syria. We missed that opportunity. I think we were too risk averse. And secondly, I think the original parameters of the Geneva process was to get Bashar al-Assad's regime to negotiate with the leaders of the opposition. And as you know, meetings were held in Istanbul between the two groups in order to negotiate transitional process toward elections, constitutional reform, elections, and a post-Assad regime. This meant one of the key assumptions was that we had to deal with Bashar al-Assad's regime. But one of the problems we had is that at the very beginning, and I'm no fan of Bashar al-Assad, especially after his decision to brutally fire on his own people and all the consequences. But the original assumption was that we had to work with the regime. We, the international community and the opposition, had to work with the regime in order to get this political transition process going. I think Washington's rhetoric got ahead of the policy and demonized Bashar al-Assad in person and saying he was illegitimate and he had to step down. All right, that's fair. Everyone would like to have him step down. But again, if your policy is to get the opposition to deal with the regime, there's a contradiction there. And so from the very beginning, we've had a confusion in our policy approach towards Syria. There are many people, especially minority groups, who prefer, as our caller from Bayside mentioned, they'd rather deal with the devil they know than the devil they don't know. But it's a sad commentary when the situation is so horrific and the options are so few. So I think that what should be done is that if there's any prospect of bolstering the opposition now, getting Assad's attention that he can't win this militarily, inducing the regime to come back to talks with the opposition and inducing the opposition to come back to talks with the regime, then I think that's the only hope for a political process to survive. But I would not favor opting for embracing Bashar al-Assad and his regime, that Washington do that because of what he's done, what he represents. I think that would be a mistake.
One of the photographs from USA Today, just to give you a sense of the devastation and the fighting still going on throughout much of Syria, and another photograph from Damascus that gives you a sense of the buildings. If you want to check out the photographs and the stories available online at usatoday.com. Quick follow-up on this from a viewer saying, what is the name of the rebel group that you speak of? Or are they groups?
Good question. It's called the Syrian Opposition Coalition. It is headed by a man by the name of Jarba. There's a Syrian National Council, and then the military arm is the Free Syrian Army. So yes, there are organized groups that are identifiable, that have known people, and in fact, Jarba, the head of the Syrian Opposition Coalition, was in Washington. The head of the Free Syrian Army has been in Washington. He may still be there, I don't know. And there have been negotiations recently on the requests of the Syrian opposition for more robust military assistance from Washington and from Washington's allies, especially the Saudis, the UAE, and other countries in the Arab world that are very much involved in the Syrian crisis. What the Syrian opposition leaders are asking Washington, according to news reports, is they certainly want to obtain anti-aircraft equipment. They want to try to break the monopoly of air power that Assad's regime has so effectively and brutally used against the rebel groups and Syrian civilians. The dilemma that Washington has, in all fairness on that, is that if Washington does provide anti-aircraft weaponry, and I don't think they're considering man-pad missiles, but something short of that. If this equipment falls into the hands of the Islamic radical groups in Syria, they can be used by these terrorist groups against all sorts of targets in the region and against us, against Israel. So therefore, this is a very complex issue. What the Syrian opposition is stating, according to these reports, is that being furnished, if they have indeed been furnished with anti-tank and anti-armor equipment, weapons, that if the rebel groups use these effectively and under controlled circumstances, that could be a precedent to go the next step and provide them with anti-aircraft weaponry. But that seems to be where talks are now. Again, if you look at the military political landscape in Syria, if Assad's air power is not somehow limited or at best neutralized, he will enjoy a monopoly of power, and I don't think he will perceive that he cannot win militarily. He'll probably think that he can win militarily. And it's only when that judgment on the part of the regime in Damascus is altered that I think he will seriously negotiate, or his regime will seriously negotiate with the rebels.
And another view from the city of Homs, which was viewed as a rebel stronghold, but now, according to USA Today, those rebels have moved out. Our guest is Peter Djerejian, who is now the director of the Baker Institute at Rice University. There's this comment from Victor, who says no such thing as being too risk-averse on Syria after 2 big-foot decade-long wars not paid for during a Great Recession. And we'll go to Carnell, joining us from Mobile, Alabama. Independent Line, good morning.
Good morning. You know, trying to follow the American government with these different wars and overthrowing of governments, it almost gives the American people whiplash. Okay, Ukraine, we just got involved in Ukraine. They overthrew the government there. They're fighting and killing people there. You go back to Egypt. Okay, you go back to Libya. You go to Iraq. And everyone who really watches this kind of stuff knew that after Ukraine, the government was going to turn back toward Syria, because this gentleman mentioned, or someone mentioned, who supports Syria, but Russia also has warm water port in Syria. So I knew that once they finished in Ukraine, and anyone who follows this stuff knows that the American government was involved in the overthrow. If you go to YouTube to Victoria Nuland, just Google and go to Victoria Nuland. It's just sad that we're spending so much money overthrowing governments, but why don't we look at Saudi Arabia?
Carnell, thanks for the call. We'll get a response.
Well, look, in the larger historic picture, what the caller is indicating is, rightfully so, the American public's absolute fatigue with U.S. military involvement in the Arab and Muslim world. In my view, after 9/11, the first Afghan war, when we invaded Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban, who was giving safe haven to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, who attacked us in our homeland on 9/11. That was a just war. There was no question overthrowing the Taliban regime that gave safe haven to this terrorists who attacked Americans was a just war. What happened, unfortunately, in my view, is that instead of staying the course in Afghanistan and keeping the focus on doing everything possible to make Afghanistan terrorist-free and on the path toward a elected governments where moderate forces, not extremist forces, would prevail. The decision was made in March of 2003 to invade Iraq and to overthrow Saddam Hussein. I think that was a war of choice and not necessity. Because if you think of where the United States was in 2003, after a couple of years after 9/11, when even the whole world was with us. The largest French daily, Le Monde, had a banner-to-banner headline, Nous sommes tous Américains. We are all Americans. Everyone is with America after 9/11. We were in a preeminent diplomatic position to get the international community to put hermetically sealed stranglehold sanctions on Saddam Hussein and his regime. We should have taken that path if there was real concern over weapons of mass destruction and the other reasons for going to war, which, of course, the weapons of mass destruction were never found. So I certainly understand the public opinion in our country about America's involvements in these wars in the Middle East. And I am not an advocate of sending American troops on the ground in Syria at all. For example, the end game in Afghanistan, after our spilling so much blood and treasure, is unknown. Hopefully, one can hope that the Afghans will struggle through some sort of electoral democracy in their own way, but the jury is out. Iraq is in a dismal situation today, where radical Islamic groups that we fought, where our Marines and our soldiers fought, have reappeared. So in putting it in the larger context of U.S. military engagement in the Middle East, we don't want to overextend ourselves again, and I would never be a proponent of that.
Mr. Ambassador,
what I'm saying in Syria...
I've got to jump in because we're very short on time. You have about 10 seconds left.
Okay. Okay. No, I think what we need to do is to reassess our position and our policy towards Syria, determine exactly how we can provide more effective humanitarian, economic, and military assistance to the rebels, how to engage the international community on a path toward political transition to eventually a post-Assad regime. I think we need to reassess our policy in Syria.
We thank you very much for being with us on this Sunday and giving us your perspective on the situation in Syria. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
And by the way, we'll continue the conversation tomorrow morning. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Congress is back, both the House and the Senate. A busy week here in Washington, D.C. We hope you tune in at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Newsmakers is next. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a great week ahead.